Ch2. In the Tokyo Air Traffic Control Center, 20 air traffic controllers were at their posts, carefully watching radar screens and chattering into their headsets as they manned their radio and tracking consoles. When one controller received the call from the Starlifter, it sounded entirely routine. Tokyo Control, came the voice through his headset. MAC 50231, position Rocky, 1035, flight level 330, estimating 40 north, 160 east, 1150, 443 north, 170 east, next. MAC 50231, the controller answered. Tokyo Control, roger. Captain Weisfield remained calm and steady as Max shut down the radio. The message Max had just sent to Tokyo told the control center that the Starlifter MAC 50231 was heading east toward the United States on its planned flight path, flying at 33,000 feet. Max knew the Starlifter was now out of Tokyo's radar range. They would never know that Max had lied and that the Starlifter was heading south, destination still unknown. Nice plan so far, huh? Said Max, chewing rudely on a wad of gum. By the time we quit broadcasting our position reports, they'll all think we disappeared somewhere up in the Aleutians. So where are we going? Asked Weisfield. Well, Captain, I'm going to put some coordinates into the navigation system that will take us straight south, between Wake and Guam. The Carolines are nice this time of year, don't you think? What if we don't have enough fuel to reach wherever you're taking us? Oh, don't worry about that. We'll have plenty. I've already figured that out. Looks like you've thought of everything, said Weisfield. So far, Captain, so far, said Max with a laugh. The Starlifter flew on, heading south. Inside the cargo compartment, Lila and Lieutenant Jameson sat very still under Al's gun. Al had finally let them take their hands off their heads, but only after their arms began falling asleep. Lieutenant Jameson tried to look calm and pleasant as he asked Lila, "How are you doing?" Lila was looking down at the deck, deep in thought. It took her just an extra moment to come up with an answer. I'm scared." He smiled to reassure and said, "Hey, that's normal." "No, that's not what I mean." He leaned over a little to listen. Lila looked around as if searching for the words, then said quietly, "I'm afraid, well, what if I never get a chance to see my father and brother again?" He touched her hand and said, "Hey, you will. You mustn't worry about that." She hesitated for a moment and then forced herself to say it. "My father and I, we had some very unkind words before I left. I feel terrible about some of the things I said, and what bothers me is that those words were the very last we ever said to each other." Jameson didn't answer right away. He took some time to ponder. Finally, he said very gently, "It's good that you're thinking about it." Then he smiled. "Funny, isn't it, how troubles makes us stop and think?" "What do you mean?" He even chuckled a little. "Ah, you know, the way we humans are. We just keep right on doing what we're doing, even if it's wrong, and maybe we never hear God calling to us until we find ourselves in a jam. Then we stop, and we get quiet, and we listen." Lila wasn't ready for any little sermons. Well, kind of like Jonah. He tried to run from God, so God brought some trouble into his life to stop him so he and Jonah could have a talk. Being swallowed by the big fish, you mean? Yeah, now that got Jonah's attention. But hey, listen, I'm not the one who's wrong here. I mean, it's my dad who's the problem. He smiled again and said, "Well, only you would know that for sure, but as far as I've ever seen, most fights require at least two people." Lila just wasn't ready for this. "Can we talk about something else?" Jameson nodded. "Yes, we can." He paused for a moment. Al was near the ladder to the flight deck. a fairly good distance from him, and the whole compartment was very noisy, with the roar of the engines outside and the rushing of the ventilation system inside. Jameson was content that they could speak without being heard. Now don't turn around to look, but do you remember seeing a huge container toward the back of the plane? A big steel thing like a big bottle? He nodded. Right. He lowered his voice, but still smiled and looked casual, as if talking about nothing important. Lila, that's a special weapons pod for carrying sensitive cargo. It's airtight, watertight, and they tell me it's bulletproof. It's like a big safe, you understand? He pointed out the window as if showing her something, and she looked, but he wasn't talking about anything outside. There's an entry hatch at the other end toward the back of the plane, and I think it's unlocked at the moment. Now listen to me. If any trouble breaks out or any real danger, shooting, fighting, anything like that, you get yourself inside that pod and close that hatch. You'll be safe in there until the ruckus is over. After another hour, Max sent out another false position report, telling the control center in Honolulu that they were on course, heading east, only about an hour west of the Aleutians. Actually, the Starlifter was heading for the equator out over the Pacific. And that should do it, said Max. He reached down and switched off all the radio equipment. We'll keep everything nice and quiet from here on out. We don't talk to them, and they don't talk to us. Within an hour, the control center in Honolulu noticed that Mach 50231's position report was overdue. The controller, listening for it, waited just a few minutes and then sent out a call. MAC 50231, Honolulu. No answer. MAC 50231, Honolulu. No answer. The controller called several more times, then contacted the control center in San Francisco. San Francisco, this is Honolulu. We're unable to raise MAC 50231. Last position, 1150, flight level 330, 43 north, 170 east. Are you in contact? Negative, Honolulu. The controller called his supervisor. Ed, we have a negative response from MAC 50231. The supervisor came over to the console. That Air Force flight? Any other aircraft in the vicinity? The controller checked. One commercial flight, United 497 from Seattle to Tokyo. See if they can raise them. Honolulu Control contacted the United Airlines flight, and the airliner sent out several calls to the Air Force plane that was supposed to be in the area. That controller spoke with his headset. United 497 Honolulu, any response? Honolulu, United 497, negative, came the answer. Better call Yokota, said the supervisor. The controllers at Yokota Air Base weren't at all happy with the news that their Starlifter had fallen silent. It could very well mean trouble. Their commander barked orders. Phelps advised 22nd Air Force Headquarters that we may need search and rescue. Corey? Sir? Get the flight plan and the manifest for 50231. I want to know who and what's on that plane. He got back on the telephone. Keep trying to raise them, Honolulu, and tell San Francisco to stay near the phone. The Starlifter flew on, and little was said by the hijackers. Al remained at his post, keeping a wary eye on Lila and Lieutenant Jameson. Every once in a while, Lila could hear Max talking to the crew in the cockpit, making sure the plane was going where Al and Max wanted it to go, wherever that was. Then Lila saw something out the window. Lieutenant! She looked out the window. He looked out the window as well. They were passing a small island, just a tiny hump in the middle of the vast ocean, surrounded by a pale blue shoal and white rings of surf. Yoshida reported, approaching the northern Marianas. Watch it now, said Max, letting the gun barrel give importance to his words. Just do what the navigation system tells you and no tricks. I don't want to attract anyone's attention. Captain Weisfeld kept the course even and steady. "So where are we going?" Lieutenant Jamison asked. "You'll find out," Al replied. "I suppose you have your very own airstrip somewhere that's big enough to land this bird." Al only smiled a wicked smile and said, "Well, let's just say we're borrowing one for the time being. It's an old airstrip the Japanese built during the war. It's in a pretty lonely place. So lonely, I don't think anyone even knows about it." The man named Corey burst into the Yokota control room with the documents filed for the flight. He handed them directly to the commander, who hurriedly scanned them. "Oh, great," he muttered. Then he said it louder. "Oh, great. That's just terrific." He handed the documents to a lieutenant. "The cargo manifest is classified. Whatever that plane's carrying, no one's supposed to know about it. Are you getting through to the 22nd? Phelps, we might have ourselves a real problem here." But then the lieutenant found something else in the manifest. "Hey, we've got another problem. There was a civilian on board." "What?" The commander looked as the lieutenant pointed it out. "Lila Cooper, 13 years old, civilian passage to McCord. On a classified flight? How did that happen?" The lieutenant read further. A government cultural exchange program. Her family is still here in Japan. Apparently she had to leave abruptly, and yes, it was authorized." The commander paced a bit, stroking his chin, combing his hair with his fingers, turning this way, then that. "I would say, sir," continued the lieutenant, "that we are looking at a monumental embarrassment if we lose that plane." Phelps had 22nd Air Force Headquarters on the line. "Got them, sir." The commander snatched up the phone. "This is Myers. We've lost contact with MAC 50231 en route from Yokota to McCord. We'll get you the last reported position. See if you can raise them or cite them. But get this. The cargo was highly classified, right? Hang on. I have one more for you. There was a civilian on board, a teenage girl from the States. You're going to have a hard time keeping this quiet. But keep a lid on it. You follow? We'll be in touch." He set the phone down and tried to do some heavy thinking. The lieutenant had a disturbing question. "What about the family of that girl?" "What about them?" "Should we notify them?" The commander looked at the lieutenant as if the question was a stupid one, but then gave it some more thought. "Oh, brother. If we're not careful, we're going to be looking at a breach in security a mile wide." He thought for a moment longer. "No, don't notify them. Not yet. We still have time. Let's not say any more than we have to anyone." Max kept watching every move the flight crew made. Weisfeld was trying to be cooperative. Suddenly, a green light lit up on the center instrument console. "What's that?" Max demanded. It's..." Westfield started to answer. "We're being tracked," Max shouted. "Someone has us on radar." Bob Mitchell, the flight engineer, tried to explain. "It's just a communication light." "Don't fool with me," Max yelled. "I know this plane well enough to know we're picking up a radar signal." Weisfeld tried to offer an explanation. "It might be the base in Guam picking us up, but I'm not sure." "Well, get away from it." "How? Max, we're out in the middle of flat ocean." "Just do it." Al could hear Max shouting and stood up. "Max, what's up?" He wasn't watching Lieutenant Isaac Jamison. It was a sudden move, a very slight chance taken, but Jamison took it. He leaped from his seat and pounced on Al, grappling with him, trying to get control of the gun. Al kicked, screamed, and hollered as the gun went off like a string of firecrackers, punching an arc of holes in the ceiling and filling the air with pungent smoke. There was a sudden loud hissing of escaping air. Lila immediately dropped to the floor and rolled behind a pallet of crates for cover, her ears numb by the blast of the gun, her heart racing with terror. Max burst out of the cockpit at the sound of Al's cries, saw Jameson and Al scuffling, and screamed, "Hold it, Jameson, or you're a dead man." Jameson weakened his grip a little, and it was all Al needed to shove him away. Max tried to bring Jameson down with a burst of gunfire, but then he was suddenly grabbed from behind by Bob Mitchell. Max screamed and struggled, and his finger locked down on the trigger, releasing a frenzied volley of bullets that zinged off the metal floor, ricocheted and pinged about the compartment, and traced sparks and blazing streaks through the smoke-blued air. 2 bullets hit Jameson, and he fell to the deck. He immediately looked at Lila, his face contorted with pain, and nodded toward the weapons pod. Max was out of control and kept firing his gun at nothing in particular. More bullets punched through the Starlifter's skin. An alarm began to sound, and the compartment lights came to full brightness. The cabin pressure was dropping. Al tried to fire at Mitchell, sending a spray of bullets into the flight deck that punched holes through the control panels and instruments. Mitchell was hit and fell to the cargo compartment floor. An explosion, smoking metal fragments, burst through the plane's left side, tearing the plane open. Al disappeared through the hole like a particle of dust into a vacuum cleaner. The Starlifter reeled to one side, then the other, swayed, dipped, rocked. The crew on the flight deck had grabbed their oxygen masks and were breathing from emergency supplies as Captain Weisfield gripped the controls and tried to keep the plane steady. "Number 2 engine, fire." He immediately threw the number 2 throttle back. "Throttle, idle start." He yanked at a handle above him. "Fire handle number 2, pulled. Extinguishing agent released." Jack Yoshida leaped over to the flight engineer's panel and tried to assess what had happened. Rapid loss of cabin pressure. The cabin wall is perforated. Some bullets must have hit the engine. Captain Weisfield noticed his shoulder turning red from a wild ricochet. He switched on the radio. "Mayday, Mayday, MAC 50231. The plane began to shudder and slide from side to side. He shoved the control yoke forward, and the Starlifter nearly stood on its nose, diving toward the earth. He was trying to get down to a safer, breathable altitude. Lila couldn't breathe. Her mind was melting away, and her vision was going black as she finally managed to grab an oxygen bottle off the wall and slap the mask over her face. Life coursed through her veins, and she woke again. But now she was rolling, sliding down the steeply inclined deck toward the front of the plane. She grabbed a pallet with a free hand and hung on. The plane was bucking like an angered stallion. She couldn't look out the gaping hole in the wall and see the big jet engine just outside, now billowing smoke and flame, its side blown open. Some pieces of it were actually lying inside the cargo compartment. Max had tumbled to the front of the compartment and now lay sprawled on the floor, his face and hands a deathly blue. He no longer held the machine gun. He wasn't moving at all. Lieutenant Jameson was bleeding from wounds in his chest and hip, and he too had grabbed an emergency oxygen bottle and was gasping air from it. He kept looking at Lila, motioning for her to get to the weapons pod. She began to climb toward it, gasping from the oxygen mask, grabbing any handhold she could find. It was like climbing a very steep, rolling, bucking hill, but she was getting closer. Weisfield was getting weak. He kept the Starlifter in a dive, watching the altimeter, but he could tell the big ship was dying. "Loss of hydraulic system number 2, Yoshida reported. "The fire," said Weisfield. "It's torching through the control lines. We're going to have to ditch this thing." The Starlifter was swaying and zigzagging crazily through the air, dropping toward the ocean. They were below 10,000 feet now. Weisfield pulled back on the control yoke, and the big plane tried to struggle out of its dive, shuddering and shaking like a broken kite. "Hang on," said Weisfield. "We're going for a swim." Lila could feel Lieutenant Jameson's arms around her. He was holding her steady, trying to help her along. The plane had leveled a little, but it was still diving, rocking, swaying, fishtailing. Both of them were praying. They could hear the roar of the air over the plane's fuselage and the loud crackling of the left wing being eaten by white-hot fire. The increasing atmospheric pressure felt like it would burst the eardrums. Lila could look out the window directly beside her and see the cloud layers whisking by them like floors going by a dropping elevator. The ocean was rapidly getting closer and closer. "Inside, girl, inside," said Lieutenant Jameson, giving her a boost with his hand. Lila reached and pulled herself up into the large hatch of the weapons pod. Rolling into its dark interior, she looked back, but Jameson had collapsed out of sight. "Lieutenant Jameson," she cried, scurrying toward the hatch. He reappeared, struggling to stay on his feet, very faint, very weak. He slammed the hatch shut, and she was in total darkness. She could hear him outside, tinkering with the lock. Lieutenant Isaac Jameson, bleeding and dying, held himself up with one free arm as he worked the locking mechanism, threw the bolt into place, removed the special key. Lila lay in the dark, still feeling the star lifter reeling, swaying, dropping. Impact! The pod lurched and rang like a bell as metal fragments and debris struck against it. She heard the tearing, ripping sound of the starlifter's skin peeling away, and then the thunderous crashing of water. Then came the tumbling, the endless rolling like a stone skipping across the water. She was being tossed about inside the pod like a garment in a dryer, reaching, grabbing for something, anything. There was one final blow, one final crashing of the pod, and Lila lost all awareness, slipping into a dream.